Hello, Bruce. How are you doing today?
I am doing well. Thanks for having me on.
Welcome to Relationships Labs. And thank you so much for accepting my invitation. I know you're super busy. I wanted to have this conversation, and I thought, what's the best way to learn from you, having you on the podcast? So there you go. We are here. So before we start, Bruce, would you like to share your favorite quote, something that inspires or motivates you? You would like to, share with our audience?
Oh, happy to. Yeah, the one that comes to mind is from Anne Lamott, who is a novelist, but she's written quite a lot about issues around the idea of forgiveness when you've been really hurt by something. And the quote that I have in mind is she says, "To not forgive is like drinking rat poison and then waiting for the rat to die." I just love
Mm,
that quote, because it's all about recognizing that when you haven't forgiven, you're carrying around this poison. It's hurting
mm.
you. It's not hurting the person. Well, it may or not be hurting the person you haven't forgiven, but it's certainly hurting yourself. And when you've been able to get rid of that poison, then this is not her part of it, but I always like to add, yeah, when you've got the poison out of you, then you can deal with the rat. You may
Mm.
still be dealing with the rat. You have to figure out what to do about that, but at least you're not sick. And so I love that quote.
Thank you so much for sharing that. I think that's quite deep.
Mm.
And as you mentioned about forgiveness, I think most of the times in relationships, especially with couples nowadays in, this current world, we have a forgiveness attached to uh, sort of like a, a sense of cheating in this space. So I would like to go a little bit deeper into that, if that's okay with you. Why should anyone forgive cheating? Like, doesn't that just make you look weak? I mean,
Mm.
there was an incident. I don't know if you follow Beyonce. She
Not,
forgave.
I know who she is, but not closely. Maybe that's because I'm one of the boomer generation, so she's like a kid, but but I know
Okay.
who she is.
Yeah, I mean, there was an incident when she forgiven Jay-Z, after
Uh-huh.
the Lemonade incident. Some people say that it's a power move, or some people say it's a public self-sabotage. But I think, even though if you don't know the incident, but I think you can enlighten us about the forgiving nature of forgiving.
Sure. Yeah, well, I wrote a whole book about it. There's that first of all, the one thing I'll say about, when to forgive is sometimes you shouldn't forgive. You're not ready to forgive yet. What does it mean when somebody has betrayed you? Well, they've hurt you in a way that you never would have thought that person would hurt you based on your relationship with them. And so if you've been betrayed, then now you have to figure out when you get over the shock, which is usually the initial part of it, then you have to get a hold of yourself enough to figure out what do you want to do with this relationship. And what I note about forgiveness, that idea you were saying that a lot of people think that, yeah, if you forgive somebody, aren't you being weak? Aren't you setting yourself up to be hurt again?
Mm,
Maybe, but indeed, to actually forgive is not a thing of weakness. It's actually something you can only do when you feel very strong about your own sense of self. And it is one of the issues that people have to deal with a lot when they're considering, let's take the example of, let's say, spouses, married
mm,
people, and somebody cheats, and then the other person's trying to figure out, do they want to restore the relationship, assuming that the one who did the cheating is, wants to restore the relationship.
mm.
And a lot of their friends and people who care about them will be telling them, well, don't do that. You're just, that would be weak. You need to be strong and take care of yourself.
Indeed.
Well,
Yeah.
indeed, you do need to be strong and take care of yourself, but that doesn't always mean to restore the relationship. So sometimes it means restore the relationship or not restore the relationship. The thing about forgiveness, and that's why I quoted Anne Lamott initially, the thing about forgiveness is, depending on how you define the concept of forgiveness, you can forgive somebody and not trust them at all.
Mm,
You can forgive somebody in the sense that Anne Lamott was talking about. You can forgive somebody in terms of letting go of the poison and have no intention of restoring the relationship.
mm.
So, and
Interesting.
in some ways, if you're going to make a decision about restoring the relationship, you'd better be clear minded enough to do that, which is to say, you better not be distracted by rage or anger or shock or panic. You need to be clear minded, which is to say, you need to get past fighting with yourself about why it happened or the fact that it happened,
Mm.
accept that it happened, and then you can calm down, figure out, all right, now what do you want to do about this relationship? So forgiveness turns out to be a really important part of healing a relationship, even if you want to restore it.
Mm.
But that's, my point about, you can forgive somebody you don't trust. Clearly, I'm defining forgiveness. I'm not saying that forgiveness means you're necessarily going to restore the relationship. A lot of people use that term, when people are saying, oh, it would be weak to do it. A lot of times what they mean is, well, if you just overlook what they did to you,
Mm.
try and forget about it, which is kind of ridiculous. You're not going to forget about a huge trauma of that sort.
Yeah.
But, try and get past it and just, don't worry about it or something. That's nonsense. That's not how people are going to operate. And
Mm.
so if they're defining forgiveness as saying, oh, just forget about it, well, that's a bad idea. But if you define forgiveness as getting the poison out of you,
Mm.
then that empowers you. Then you can actually consider, all right, what do I want to do about this relationship? So, I don't know the specifics of Beyonce and Jay-Z. I do vaguely remember. That was a while ago, right? That was a number of years
Yeah,
ago.
a little
Yeah.
bit while ago, yeah.
Yeah. But if somebody can have a sense that, okay, if our deal is monogamy,
Mm.
I'm going to have to find some way of believing if somebody cheated on me, and I have to find some way of believing that something is different now so that that's not likely to happen again. And that's a process. Restoring trust, forgiveness, the way I'm defining forgiveness is really an inside job. You know what I mean?
Mm.
Forgiveness, you can forgive somebody without the cooperation of the other person. But restoring trust, that takes both parties.
Indeed, indeed.
That takes work.
Yeah, that gives me quite a lot of food to think. And you mentioned something while we were talking about like that's kind of enlightening for me that not necessarily when you forgive someone is you're going in the direction where you want to keep the relationship
Hmm.
or continue the relationship, right? When you think so, for example, the case we had, I think if I remember it correctly, um it was related to Kim and I think Kanye. They were
Yeah.
together for a very long time. You know, some people say it was loyalty. I think it's more about PR or something like that. But uh, going deeper into that, I mean, is staying in a bad relationship, is it worse than just ending it?
Well, of course, I think it depends on the specifics
Mm.
because people have lots of reasons to either want to stay in a relationship or not want to stay in a relationship. Very often, yeah, well, one of the things I talk about with couples almost always in the first session, it's part of my first session structure. My first sessions tend to be quite structured. After that, it's more like improv,
Mm.
like improv theater. But the first session is quite structured. And one of the things I always do in there is I talk to folks about two different sets of needs we're trying to fulfill by being in a couple. And they're both important. They're both needs. I'm using that word carefully. It's not just
Mm.
desires, these are needs. And they're both important, and yet they're somewhat in conflict. And the two sets of needs I'm referring to are stability and intimacy. Well, when
Mm.
there's been some kind of betrayal, that they're both of those factors are important. People, for example, a married couple who have kids and they've built a life together and they've been together for a long time, they
Mm.
have powerful reasons to want to make it work if it can, because it's incredibly disruptive to break up, to separate their lives, especially if they have kids. You know, if they have kids, usually they're going to have a relationship, even if they decide not to stay together. So they
Mm.
have powerful reasons to want to heal in some way, whether it's as a married couple or as at least as co-parents.
Mm.
So people have powerful reasons sometimes for wanting to figure out how can we make this work. And I will say it's really interesting. I find it interesting. I do not keep track of what percentage of couples where there's cheating stay together or don't. In my
Mm.
practice, they're all interesting and unique in their own ways.
Yeah.
But I will note that when couples are able to recover from something like that and stay together,
Mm.
first of all, it's my bias. I find that inspiring. I like it. I like that better. I mean, they don't have to do that to please me, but I like that better.
Mm.
It's less, of course, less disruptive. And
Yeah.
they will very often express gratitude. Once they've done the work, they will often express gratitude for having gone through the crisis.
Mm,
They'll be better off than they were before. It's the only way that you're going to recover from cheating, usually,
mm,
is by
mm,
being better off than you were even before the cheating. They might not have realized it, but the couples that heal will look back and say, "Wow, we didn't realize it, but we were headed for some bad times." That's
mm,
the context in which the cheating happened. That doesn't make it okay. That doesn't mean it was morally justifiable. It just means, wow, this had a context. Look how much better off we are now. We now know we've restored our ability to talk to each other and be intimate with each other, and not just sexually, but emotionally. And so we now know that if things were heading in that direction, we would head it off. We would know
mm.
about it before. That's part of how you can rebuild trust there. So those are the couples that will often express gratitude. They'll say, wow, never heard anybody say, thanks for cheating. Appreciate it. Yeah, I haven't heard that one. But, close to it, because I've had people say, hey, thanks for precipitating that crisis.
Mm,
Apparently we were headed for one. We didn't realize it. And you were the one who, I had one person I talk about in one of my books. She turned to her husband. It was our last session because they were leaving town. It
mm,
was their last session, and she turned to her husband and said, "Hey, thanks for taking one for the team."
mm.
And he said, "What do you mean by that?" And she said, "Well, you're the one who has to feel guilty because he was the one who cheated. So he had to feel guilty, and he did. He
Yeah.
absolutely did appropriately. He
Mm,
knew he
mm,
did something wrong." But she said, well, you had to feel guilty, but we are so much better off now, not only with each other. She was talking about how much better off she was in
mm,
all of her relationships. She was so much better off with her kids. She was better off with her coworkers. She was better off with her friends because she wasn't freaking out all the time.
mm.
For having gone through that, it put a lot of stuff in perspective and gave her a much clearer sense of who she was. And so she was grateful. It was really interesting. She
Definitely. And
wasn't happy that he cheated, but happy for the crisis.
happy for the guys. Yeah, and I want to touch on the intimacy part, but before we go there, I want to pick your brains on that. Like, do most people, or actually, do most couples come to you to to you to fix things or to get someone to blame their partner? I mean, look at Johnny Depp and Amber Heard, right? Everybody
Oh,
heard their
God,
case,
yes.
like they were in the courtroom, they're fighting with each other, and
Yeah.
for some reason or another or other, I sat down in a bar with a lot of friends of mine, couples, males, females, and majority of the audience, and we used to look at this courtroom drama, right, all the
Mhm.
time. Majority of the audience, even though they were females, they were supporting Johnny Depp for some reason. I
Hmm.
don't know why. I was
Yeah.
very, very surprised. I was supporting him. It felt like we are watching a football game for some reason because we have to be one side, right? So these courtroom therapy with cameras and all these things, is this something you felt in your sessions with couple that it's something sometimes some couple want to have this kind of feeling, that's why they come to you, or is it just legitimately they want to fix things?
Mhm. Yeah, I think there's elements of both. Certainly, when they first come, they are often very much in blame mode.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
maybe they're looking to me to be a judge or something. That's the thing about a courtroom, of course. It is adversarial by its very
Indeed.
nature. So
Yeah.
you're going to end up, it's all about taking sides. Both sides are trying
Mm.
to get you to take their side. And what happens in my sessions, I think it happens very quickly, is it is evident early on, and I generally have to say this out loud. It just sort of shows up. It's evident early on that I'm not there to be the judge. I'm not there to adjudicate their problems. I'm not there to say you're right and you're wrong. I
Mm.
am there to help them figure out what they want to do. And so, and it's there's a there's I think there's something I think is really central to doing this work effectively, which is I genuinely do not believe that I know better than they do how they should live their lives.
Mm.
If they're looking for me to, give them the judgment, they're not going to get it, not because I'm withholding it, but because I genuinely don't have it. I
Mm.
genuinely don't think I know better than they do how they should live their lives. They've got to figure that out themselves. I absolutely respect that for both parties. So
Mm.
what they're going to get from me isn't, I'm not going to be seeking data to support or refute what they are claiming.
Mm.
I'm not a judge or a jury or a prosecutor or a defense attorney, any of the
Mm.
above. I am there to help them, ideally help them both feel respected, both feel like they have the, appropriate power to figure out what they want to do, and
Mm.
then they'll see where they want to go with it. So, I'm in general, because I'm not rendering judgments, they stop seeking them. They don't seem to, go for it. The
Mm.
structure that I set up is all about saying, wow, this is difficult, this is painful. Let's all be on one side and get the problems on the other and figure out what you can do about it.
Got it. Got it. So, so let's move back to our intimacy part then. Adam Levin's DMs. It was everywhere on the social media, right? Why are why are couples scared to talk about sex,
Yeah.
even when it is real problem?
Yeah. Yeah. Isn't that interesting that they are so
It
scared?
is.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, because it's important and they don't know how it's going to turn out.
Mm.
And understandably don't know how it's going to turn out. Now, why they're often scared to talk about anything that threatens stability. So sex often is hugely threatens stability. If you
Mm.
factor in, look, couples often have trouble talking about money. They have trouble talking about how to raise the kids. I mean, they might have trouble talking about anything that's important. I think sex in particular, certainly in Western culture, that's a broad statement. That's a broad brush right there. But we tend to be give enormous double messages to everybody. You're all supposed to be okay talking about it, and yet you better be afraid to talk about it. We shame people about their sexual fantasies or sexual thoughts or whatever.
Mm.
So, most of us in Western cultures, at least in the United States anyway, I don't know overstate, but
Mm.
most of us grow up in circumstances where talking about it isn't easy. Our parents
Got it.
freeze up if we talk about it. Our teachers won't. They give sex education in some schools, but it's
Mm.
really all about physiology and anatomy, and it has nothing to do with emotions. And actually, it certainly has almost nothing to do with pleasure. They won't
Mm.
teach about that in school. It's like, oh my God, if you tell kids it might be fun, they might want to do it. Well, of course they're going to want to do it. They're doing it anyway. And then there's all sorts of issues why kids get messages about sex that are not terribly helpful and just helping them talk about it. So there's all of that. But the general anxiety people will have when some important thing comes up is often because it threatens stability. Because stability is
Mm.
important too. You build a life together, you want to keep the anxiety level relatively low. And to bring up something when you don't know how it's going to turn out raises anxiety.
Mm.
And it's not crazy to want to minimize anxiety. Anxiety, evolution has designed anxiety to feel terrible. That's what it's about. It's like, do something different here. But the problem is by avoiding it, what ends up happening is that becomes destabilizing because intimacy
Mm.
is every bit as much of a need for a couple as stability is. And when I say intimacy, I'm not just talking about sex, I'm
Mm.
talking more generally the feeling of being alive with each other, the feeling of being present and honest with yourself and each other at the same time. Couples need that. Living organisms need that. My
Yeah.
favorite metaphor about stability and intimacy is if you think about a plant, you plant a seed in some soil and it germinates and it sprouts, starts to grow. Somebody comes along and paves a sidewalk over it. Why would someone pave a sidewalk over it? Well, for stability, right? It's easier to walk on.
Mm.
What is that plant going to do? Well, there are roots there to provide stability, but intimacy is the energy for growth. And
Mm.
it's going to try and crack the sidewalk or die trying. And
Yeah.
we see this metaphorically, you see this with couples all the time. What does it look like when a couple has prized stability so much, but therefore they've been afraid to bring up things that are scary? So they cut off intimacy, basically. Well,
Mm.
what that often looks like is an affair because they can't tolerate it. They're vulnerable to getting that intimacy somewhere else. Or it might look like getting into an argument about anything and nothing because they're constantly in a state of tension with each other and anything could set them off.
Mm.
And often they'll argue about anything except what they're really scared about.
Yeah.
Or it will look like someone getting very depressed because it feels dead when intimacy is cut off. Or it will look like somebody all of a sudden, out of the blue saying, I'm done. I'm out of here. And,
Mm.
I work with couples fairly frequently.
Breaks.
Somebody says,
Yep.
I just got blindsided. He or she just said they're out. I had no idea. Those are all symptoms of attenuated intimacy. And
Mm.
it happens, again, usually it happens because it's too scary. It threatens stability too much.
Mm. I've heard, and thank you for this analogy. It helps to understand the girth of this problem. I've heard several times that intimacy, love, sex, particularly the access to sex, is majorly in a couple, in a heterosexual couple. I don't know about others, but it's majorly controlled by female.
Ah,
When who usually controls the relationship? Is it the person who controls the sex? Is it the person who is loud, or is it the person who is quiet? How does that
well,
work?
I've got an answer for that, and it's sort of math. I
Okay.
know it's funny to call it math. I like to call it that though because it sort of takes it's like, oh, don't take this so personally. Just look at the
Mm,
math here.
mm,
If you have any consensual activity, and of course, it's important that it's consensual,
yeah.
because sex in Western culture has only been consensual for women fairly recently. The
Interesting.
concept of marital rape in the United States, all the states in the United States didn't consider that a possible crime until the 1970s.
Mm,
So, I'm well old enough to remember before when a married woman couldn't say her husband raped her because there was no such concept. He
wow.
had rights to her body,
Mm,
whether she liked it or not. Well,
mm,
that I'm glad to say that has changed. So it is a consensual activity, and any consensual activity, and sex being a really good example of that, the
mm,
person who wants it less frequently will control how often it happens. Now, is
mm,
that always the woman? Not at all. I've worked with plenty of couples where that's the man. The woman is saying, "Why can't we have sex more often?" And
mm,
the man has his reasons for, there's varieties of reasons why it doesn't work out that way.
mm.
And often it's the woman as well. But it's not the louder or the softer or whatever. It's the one who wants it less, unless somebody's a rapist,
Okay.
right? In which case that's a whole different set of problems. But assuming it is in fact consensual, and it's interesting. The reason I like to say, hey, it's just a mathematical, it just works out that way. If you
Mm,
accept the idea that in any two human beings, they probably will not be perfectly synchronized about
mm.
how often they want to have sex. Two
Yeah.
human beings, they're going to get tired at different times. They're going to feel in the mood or not in the mood, or pissed off or not pissed off, or
Mm,
whatever. All of those things are apt to change. So if you accept that it's inevitable sometimes that somebody's going to say no to someone else's proposal that they have
mm,
sex,
mm,
then the question then becomes, okay, how does that interaction go? Because if it goes well, and what do I mean by going well just means they handle it with grace.
mm,
The person being disappointed isn't a jerk about it.
mm.
The person being disappointed says, "Hey, whatever," and the person doing the disappointing isn't a jerk about it either. And it's really interesting. So often you get this phenomenon, and this especially happens, I think, in heterosexual couples, especially happens when it is the woman saying no.
Mm,
It's probably somewhat more frequent. Again, I don't want to overstate that because I've met so many couples where it's the other way around. But
mm.
let's say it's the woman who's more often saying no. The
Yeah.
man wants it more often than the woman.
Mm,
So often she'll express it in a way that's resentful. She'll say, "Why does it always have to be about sex? We can't ever touch each other without you immediately want to have sex." If
mm,
she can actually be gracious about it, she will be. Here's what it's like when somebody's gracious about that. She'll be saying, implying all this. You don't say all this out loud usually, but implying this. She'll be saying, "Wow, I'm so glad you still desire me. I'm so glad you want me. It's
mm,
not going to happen right now. I'm just not there, for whatever reason. I'm tired. I'm distracted. I'm a little annoyed with you, whatever it is, it's not going to happen now. But you know what? It's good for our relationship that you still want me that way. I like that. So I'm going to say no. And I know I'm disappointing you. And I'm going to be nice about it. I'm going to say, I'm, hey, not going to happen now, but hey, next time will be epic, or something. She'll be nice about it because
uh,
she's not bothered by the fact that she's disappointing him, because
mm,
the fact that she's disappointing him means he desires her, which is good, not bad. Often it doesn't come out that way, but when that happens, now of course, that's contingent on the man in that story
Mm,
not being a jerk about it.
mm,
So how does he receive it? He's going to say, "Oh yeah, you're disappointing me, because you're so hot. I really want you, but I totally get it. Of course, I don't want you if you're not into it, right? I want you to feel
mm.
good.
Yeah.
So hey, cool. I'll next time will be great. Let me get you a cup of tea,
Mm,
whatever. When a couple does that, they're fine. In fact, not only are they fine, they've actually, that interaction itself has strengthened their relationship. They both get, that's an intimate interaction. They both get to
mhm,
be who they are and have that be good. And they've just made, using a different metaphor, they've just made a nice deposit in the emotional bank account. They've
mm.
raised their balance in the emotional bank account. They said, oh, look at us. We can handle not being in sync about sex. Isn't that nice?
Yeah,
They're
yeah.
probably going to be okay in intimacy more generally.
Mm,
Unfortunately, it often happens. Oh, I remember a couple I worked with not all that long ago, maybe a year or two ago, where I met them. They'd been married for about 20 years. And what they told me in the first or second session, I mean, I always ask about it. I forgot when it came up, but they said, well, there was this thing that happened on their wedding night where she was just too tired. They had just been, partying and drinking, and she was exhausted. She didn't want to have sex. And it's not like they'd never had sex before. They weren't like, they didn't wait till marriage to have sex, but they
mm.
didn't, and he was a jerk about it. He was just a total jerk about it. And that set them up for 20 years of misery
Wow.
especially when it came to sex, but it then spilled over into all kinds of other aspects of their relationship.
Mm,
And again, I don't want to say it was only because of that one interaction, but that one interaction was a great example of how then she felt like, oh my God, I can't say no, which is
mm,
a great way of putting, I think, especially women, into a mood that says, I don't feel safe with this dude.
mm.
I don't want to have sex with him.
Yeah.
Even if she's got an active libido, it's like, but women in general, not to not to
I don't
mansplain to the women
feel
out there,
like it. Yeah,
but
I don't feel
it
like it.
tends to
Yeah.
be really, for good evolutionary reason, tends to be important for women to have that sense of, wow, this is a guy I feel safe and protected with to literally
Mm,
let him into my body. You know what I mean? It's different for women than it is for men for good reason.
indeed,
And so,
and that's
yeah,
why a lot. It's a common consensus. It's not like backed by data or something like that, but it's a common consensus among couples or people who are above, I don't know, 30, 45. It's like this question comes around a lot, not just on social media, but also in conversation. Like, why do women's like dump nice guys and run after the jerks? Is
yeah,
there any like what's the excitement there?
yeah. Well, I can speak to that. It's
Yeah.
related to the same idea. When intimacy is compromised, because relationships, look, individual human beings, we are organisms. A relationship, a couple is an organism too. It's a living organism. It
Mm,
needs intimacy. It needs that sense of erotic charge. There's a
mm,
guy named Jack Moran. He died a number of years ago, but back in the 90s, he wrote a book called, what was it called? I forgot what it was called. Doesn't matter. But in that book, it was talking all about eroticism,
mm,
sex and eroticism, and he coined what he called the erotic equation. And what is the
okay.
erotic equation? It was attractiveness plus obstacles equals excitement. You need obstacles.
Mm,
Now, they don't have to be artificial.
mm,
Something as simple as, "Gee, I don't know how she or he's going to feel if I propose sex right now." That's a little bit of anxiety. That's an obstacle.
mm,
Um, when it's just, exactly what's going to happen, and it's always going to be the same. And I've heard this from women. That kind of, it is a bit stereotypical, but I've heard it from women. I don't want him to be so nice to me all the time.
mm,
I want to feel that little sense of, ooh, he's going to take me. Now, again, she's not saying she wants to be taken against her will. She's saying
mm,
she wants to have that feeling that he's so into her, he just wants to take her.
mm,
That is the sort of thing that for a lot of women will just get old with a guy whose whole affect with her is that he's considerate.
mm.
Of course, it's good to be considerate. But if he's only considerate, that loses excitement. So those women who want to go with a bad guy who treats them like shit, Is it okay to
Mm.
say that on your podcast, by the
Yeah,
way? Oh,
that's
good.
allowed.
I
Yeah.
can use,
We are
yes.
just raw,
Oh, good.
thoughts.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, well, then I'll get even rawer because what I've
Mm.
heard from some of those women, and I'm not talking about, I'm not talking about women who are into being abused at all. I'm talking about women who will say, I just wish sometimes he would just fuck me.
Mm.
I just want to be taken. I want him to be overwhelmed with his desire for me because that's a turn on for her.
Mm.
She doesn't want to be abused, but that's what she wants. And the
Wounds.
guy is afraid or just isn't wired that way. And it just gets deadly.
Mm.
And so, yeah, the spark requires that it's always I love this paradox about sex in particular, that
Mm.
for passionate sex, and again, I would say passionate, it can be really romantic and loving, it can be really rough, it can be whatever it is, but for passionate sex, there has to be this paradoxical combination of selfishness
Mm.
and also generosity, both. So that what
Oh.
each party perceives is that the other one can barely contain themselves because they so want the other person. That's selfish. But
Mm.
also they want to be treated with consideration.
Mm.
And those are a little bit in conflict with each other, but when a couple, what happens with a couple where that's working well is it's never the same. There's always something new happening. They're never sure how it's going to
Mm.
go. The couples that tend to get into a really sort of deadly kind of rut is where it's always the same. They always know exactly what's going to happen. They're not able to talk about it.
Mm.
Those are the ones where somebody or one or the other is going to have to say after a while, I'm done with this. I just, I can't deal with it.
Can't
We
do it
can't talk
anymore.
about it. There's no hope
Yeah.
that it's going to change. We must be incompatible, they will often say.
So yeah, so let's touch on that point then, because you mentioned about like, you need this kind of excitement. I mean,
Hmm.
after we heard about this Tiger Woods problem back in, I
Yeah.
don't know, ages ago, right? I
Hmm.
always discuss this with my girlfriend that what if Tiger Woods' wife stayed? Could that spark have ever returned? Like, for example, can the sex ever feel wild and exciting, again after that somebody has cheated you, that somebody has literally, I mean, I don't want to use the word defamed, but it's like they have offended you publicly,
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
cheating on you, right? And you know that this person loves you because you've been with them for so long. You have a marriage. I don't know if they have kids also, multiple kids, but once you know that this person has cheated, that's been proven, you can't do anything about it. If you plan to stay, would there be any chance of having a wild and exciting sex afterwards?
Oh, yes. Yes. Now, not always,
Mm-hmm.
but because, there's lots of factors involved. But a very, very common phenomenon is there'll be a couple that's been together for a long time. Somebody goes and cheats.
Mm.
And before I even meet them, so very often I'll be meeting a couple, 2, 3 weeks after the person has disclosed the cheating or something, they got caught or whatever. But even in that interval, sometimes it's a very common phenomenon. They are having sex like crazy in ways they hadn't for decades. Sometimes
What?
that yeah, it is surprising, isn't it? It's like
Mm.
yeah, cheating will often trigger it'll break something that was in the way.
Mm.
Now, I'm not saying that solves other problems because it often doesn't, but it is really common that a couple where they were just kind of dead in the sexual department and somebody cheats and they wake up. Now, don't get me wrong, I do not recommend to couples that are having, sexual problems that somebody cheat as a way of solving their problems. It's
Mm.
not a
Mm.
good plan. It usually doesn't work out very well. Having said that, when they can recover from that, oh yeah, it often opens the door for them to be able to talk about it. It opens the door for them to be able to explore things they'd been afraid to explore. It's
Mm.
again, it's like, getting back to my other metaphor, it's cracking the sidewalk. It's like, oh, now we can grow. It's a dangerous way to do it, but it often can have that effect. So yeah, I've seen that. Yeah. And that to restore intimacy, I mentioned the idea of incompatibility, right?
Mm.
there are couples who turn out to be sexually incompatible. The classic example of that is somebody figures out in a heterosexual relationship, somebody figures out, oh my God, I'm gay. I haven't been
Okay,
willing to
yeah.
say it to myself, but I'm
Yeah.
gay. When that happens, if to the extent that that is clear, because look, even that isn't often as absolutely black and white as people think it is.
Mm.
It is sometimes. And in my generation, especially boomer generation, where it was not safe for people to even entertain that possibility that maybe they're gay. That's happened to lots of folks in my generation. But even younger folks where it's safe, um, that sort of thing says, oh yeah, turns out we're not compatible. And it isn't only sexual orientation per se. I have met couples where, oh, this is early in my practice. I've been in private practice for over 30 years now, and
Mm.
I remember in the first 2 3 years, I remember I met a couple who were in their 50s at the time, and they were talking about something else. They came to talk about some issues they were having with their kid, I think, but it came up that she had figured out in her 30s, so like 20 years before, that she was a sexual submissive, not merely a sexual submissive needing to be dominated. She
Mm.
was a sexual submissive who needed to be humiliated. That's what turned her
Wow.
on. She needed humiliation. And and this is not an unusual phenomenon for someone who says that.
Mm.
If you knew this person in real life, and outside of the bedroom,
Mm.
she was a take no prisoners lawyer. She was the sort of person that you would not want to cross her up because she'd kill you. She'd
Wow.
tear you a new one, as they would say.
Mm.
So she was not, she was no shrinking violet at all. But you know that the stereotype of the male CEOs who go to a dominatrix to be humiliated.
Mm.
She was like that. And her husband, who was this big gruff guy, her husband who loved her and she loved him, he could only pretend to do that. He couldn't, his heart wasn't in it, and she knew his heart wasn't in it. And they
Mm.
were having serious sexual compatibility problems because he didn't get off on humiliating her. He would only
Mm.
do it to please her, which is the exact opposite of what she needed. She needed
Oh,
someone who wasn't doing it to please
yeah.
her. She needed somebody who was doing it to please himself.
Yeah. Yeah.
And as soon as she saw that he was trying to make her feel good, it lost it. It's really interesting. The varieties of sexual appetites out there is really something. So sometimes that's a problem. Sometimes fetishes come up
Mm.
where they're just not compatible,
Mm.
and it's a bummer when that happens and a couple has to figure out what to do. And again, like I said earlier, it's not for me to tell them what they ought to do in that case. They have to figure that out. And I respect lots of different choices there. Sometimes couples will say, yeah, we're just going to be somewhat incompatible and that won't be the high point of our lives and we'll be okay.
Mm.
Sometimes one or the other will say, look, go get your needs taken care of somewhere else. Just don't tell me about it. I mean, there's all kinds of varieties of how to handle that.
Indeed. Indeed.
But it's a sad thing when they're not compatible.
Yeah, that's one thing, which everybody learns with time, but also you can learn it faster if you can, take help from someone like you. You also say that couples need faith, but
Mm.
isn't that just another word for ignoring the truth? What's your
No,
opinion
on
on
the
that?
contrary. Thank you for asking. Yeah. Well, of course, it depends on how you define faith, right?
Mm.
So, my definition of faith is not necessarily religious, by the way. It's not
Mm.
inconsistent with all religious faith, but it's not the same thing. When I say faith, what I mean is, here's my sort of working definition of faith. When you accept that reality is right to be what it is, not merely accepting it and saying, oh, it's awful, but I'm just going to have to put up with it, but
Mm.
saying, boy, this is painful, but there must be something here that's important and meaningful. And I may
Mm.
not be able to figure out what it is. I haven't got all the data. From a religious perspective would say, well, I haven't got a God's eye view of the universe. You know what I mean? I can't understand everything all at once. I'm in the middle of it.
Mm.
But the mindset of faith, and it's a mindset. It's not, by the way, it's not a set of knowledges or practices, or it is a practice actually, but it's not a set of knowledges.
Mm.
It's a bunch of skills. You have to practice it, and it's nothing you can prove or disprove. You can't prove that reality is right to be what it is. That's a value judgment. I'm choosing to say, well, yes, I can look around the world and I can say, well, my God, this obviously sucks. Look at all the pain and suffering and injustice and all that. Of course,
Yeah.
that's true. I can also look around the world and say, oh my God, this is wonderful. Look at all the goodness that's out there in the face of all those bad things.
Mm,
Neither one of those is inherently correct. It's a choice. And if I choose to practice faith, what I am claiming is that that opens up possibilities in ways that not having faith don't. And when you say, isn't that the same as sort of ignoring reality? No, on the contrary. And in fact, what I like to distinguish between is between faith on the one hand and fundamentalism on the other. I call those opposites. That idea of saying just ignoring reality or refusing to acknowledge reality, that's what fundamentalists do. They will
mm,
insist that they have one way, one truth. There's no other truth that they'll entertain, thereby ignoring all the realities that seem to challenge their precious ideas.
mm,
And that's not faith. That's the opposite of faith. Faith says, oh my God, of course I know I can't know everything. Of course there are things, whatever my favorite ideas are, and I'm not knocking ideas, right? Whatever my closely held beliefs are, I know that there are circumstances, there are reasons why other people have different beliefs.
mm.
They're not crazy, mostly. I mean,
Yeah, yeah,
we can all
mostly.
be crazy, but yes, there are people who are having psychotic breaks or something, but
Mm,
mostly, if half of the world believes one way and half the world believes another, like in politics, roughly, it can't be that the part that doesn't believe what I believe, it can't be that they're all crazy or evil or stupid. It just can't be true. They
mm,
must have a different frame of reference and different understandings and different data, and they're interpreting it differently. There must be something to it. A couple that comes into me, let's say with infidelity,
mm,
if they come in and they're saying, oh my God, we just want to go back to how things were before. This is terrible. And the one who cheated is saying, oh my God, I'll never do it again. I don't know what happened. Never mind. And the
mm,
other person is saying, yeah, damn right, you'll never do it again. And never mind, let's go back to how it was. Well, they are denying reality. They're
mm.
denying that there must have been something meaningful in what happened. Faith, a mindset of faith, a couple that comes with a mindset of faith is basically saying, oh my God, we're in such pain. This sucks. But there must be something meaningful here. We better figure this out. We better not
Mm,
just reject it.
mm.
That's faith. That's what I mean by faith. That's why faith is important.
To
So
believe in something. Yeah.
yeah, it's that sense, it's the mindset that says whatever it is, we better learn from it, as opposed to
Mm,
whatever it is, we better deny it. And
mm,
so my wife Judy Alexander and I do a podcast called Couples Therapy in 7 Words. And the
mm.
7 words are be kind, don't panic, and have faith. And the reason the have faith comes last is that's kind of the linchpin. If you have faith, then you won't panic about what's happening. And if
Got
you're
it.
not panicking, then you can sense that sense of kinship, which is what I mean by be kind. I don't just mean be
Mm,
nice. I mean,
mm,
recognize your essential sense of kinship with whoever it is you're dealing with. And
mm.
you can't do that if you're in a panic. And faith is the antidote to panic. Faith is what lets you not panic. At least faith as I'm
Got it.
describing.
Got it. Got it. You touched there about many elements in a relationship, not just the good but the bad and worse also, right? You also mentioned something about monogamy. Do you remember Will Smith and Jada Smith's
Yeah.
entanglement with, was it like, I was just thinking, is monogamy just a boring trap people force themselves into nowadays? Because what's happening nowadays, like, since you go into the university colleges, you start getting into relationships, and then after, like, say, I don't know, 10, 20 relationships, you find somebody whom you want to be with for the rest of the life, and then after 2 years you start cheating. But you want to showcase to your society that, oh, you're a successful modern couple, but hindsight, you've not been loyal to your previous relationships, and now also it's happening. What's your take on it?
Yeah, it's complicated, isn't it?
Mm,
It's complicated, and it is interesting how something that in my 30 years of practice, I only started doing maybe, what, 5, 6 years ago, I think. I started routinely asking a couple, if there was a couple in my office, and I would say, is your deal with each other monogamy? I
Mm.
started asking. I never asked before because I just always assumed it was.
Yeah.
And look, still in the last 5 years since I've been asking that, how many times has a couple said, well, not exactly? A handful, you know. The
Mm.
vast majority of couples still will say, yes, that is our deal. It's monogamy. So
Yeah.
most people still want to have that sense of monogamy. Is
Mm.
it just a trap, that sort of, well, if you feel that way, it's going to be difficult to maintain.
Mm.
So why should anybody be, what's the point of being monogamous? You could say, well, because we were all brought up to say that to cheat on somebody in a what's supposed to be a monogamous relationship is just wrong, and that's why we don't do it, except
Mm.
that obviously lots of people do it. So there's no guarantee, even with, that goes way, way back as far as you
Yeah.
can you can imagine.
Think
People have
about, yeah.
violated monogamy, so it's obviously not a ironclad rule that people just do. There's no commandment in the Bible that says thou shalt breathe air. You don't
Mm.
need the ones that everybody does. The only commandments you have are the ones that people violate.
Yep. Yep.
So this commandment about being, these ideas about you have to be monogamous, obviously people do violate that. I'll put in a word here about Helen Fisher. She's actually she just died in the past few months. I think last year or something. She's an anthropologist, and she wrote extensively about the anthropology of relationships.
Mm.
And what she concluded by studying dozens and dozens of human cultures, many of which were quite isolated from other cultures for a long time, and also
Mm.
comparing humans with other primates, apes and other primates. And she said, what we seem to practice, the human species seems to practice, is serial monogamy with clandestine adultery. That's what we do. In other words, she sort of said, well, if you look at what we actually do, not every individual, obviously, but the species as a whole seems to, all these different cultures have different ways of, they do practice mostly serial monogamy. There's exceptions, and mostly serial monogamy. And there is adultery, but it's generally kept secret.
Mm.
And she explains, the evolutionary reasons why this would seem to benefit both, men and women in various ways. It's sort of interesting. So, why should anybody be monogamous? Do you know what I mean? For me, what I tend to look at it as is you can look at monogamy as a rule that you shall not, that rules out everybody, billions of people all of a
Mm.
sudden are off limits to you. That feels like a restriction.
Mm.
Or you can look at monogamy as this amazing gift because when you have it and you're dedicated to it, it in some ways forces on you some growth that wouldn't necessarily be the case if you were willing to go out and find it somewhere else. And
Mm.
also, it offers to you a depth of intimacy that I don't know how to achieve any other way. Now, in saying that, I'm not trying to say it is for everybody, because clearly it isn't.
Mm.
But for people who are oriented towards it, it doesn't have to feel like a trap. It can feel like an amazing gift. The fact that you have something with each other that you have with nobody else can feel like an amazing gift. It does present a challenge. How do you maintain that sense of aliveness that we were talking about earlier? The obstacle part, how do you
Obstacle part,
maintain
yeah.
that in the context of a monogamous relationship? Well, it forces growth on you. And if you can tolerate the anxiety, because it
Mm.
involves anxiety, then it can be an amazing depth of intimacy that I don't know another way to achieve. Yeah, now
Mm.
clearly in saying that, I'm a fan. I like monogamy.
Yeah. Yeah.
Not everybody does, but I like monogamy. And I don't mean to be, dismissive of polyamory. I will
Mm.
say, before I was a psychologist way back when, I have a master's degree in statistics. I used to
Mm.
be a statistician before I got my PhD in psychology. And for my old statistical brain, I recognize I do not have a random sample of people coming to my office. I have what we would call in statistics a biased sample of people. Nobody's ever
Mm.
made an appointment with me just to tell me how well everything is going.
Mm.
Everybody's having problems. So when I hear about polyamory, I don't get to hear about polyamory when it's going well.
Yeah.
If they're making
Yeah.
appointments with me, I hear about polyamory because it's a shit show.
Yep.
It's not
Yeah.
going well. Somebody's really upset. Somebody's hurt. That's why they're consulting a couples therapist. So, I don't get to I don't get to work with folks where, oh gee, it's great. No, we're here to talk about something else. The polyamory part is fine. That what are they expecting me for? Usually doesn't.
We had some interesting interviews on BBC, um, where people in polygamy relationship came into the studio. They talked about it, how they one of the biggest one of the biggest reasons they were in polygamy relationship was around finances,
Mhm.
because living in London is so expensive right now for a couple, um, let alone having a kid. Is like you both have to work 8 years a week, and then also you won't be able to buy a house ever in your life,
Mm,
with an average salary. And then suddenly, if you have a polygamy relationship, you have one more person in it. It could be two husband, one wife, or two wife, one husband, or legally it's not possible. It's like one husband, one wife, and one is like just the occupant, but like they live together.
yeah.
And then suddenly you're splitting all the bills into three, but you also have somebody to take care of if you're growing the family when two people are going out or one person is going out. You
Yeah.
know what I mean? So that works out so well for them. So they're I thought for a while that they're advocating it in London for some reason, but then something happened with some lawyers or somebody just put some objections and they stopped interviewing those kind of people.
Oh, wow.
But yeah,
Yeah.
this has happened. This conversation is going so well, Bruce. I'm so enjoying it, but we are limited to time. And before
Sure.
going into our quick fire round, I wanted to ask you a personal question.
Sure.
You've been providing help to quite a lot of couples for a very long time. What's the dumbest thing you have ever heard in your sessions, which has cracked you?
Oh, wow. Gee, that's an interesting question. Where I immediately go is, what's the dumbest thing I've ever contributed?
Okay.
It's like, oh, I've been dumb sometimes. I think I'd go there before I'd go. Couples come to me. Of course, they're saying things that you could say are dumb because they're panicked.
Mm,
Their brains aren't working that well because they're in a mess. I know what that feels like. Anybody who's ever
mm,
had your heart broken knows what that feels like.
yeah.
So, what are the dumbest things I've done? Occasionally, I've freaked out. I mean, not hugely freaked out, but if something throws me for a loop, when that was happening, especially was in the early days of COVID, and it was all as I switched over to telehealth. I still do telehealth now exclusively since COVID, really. But
Mm,
and I remember working with a couple where one of them was talking about something that was scaring me, having to do with refusing to be vaccinated or wanting to never mind isolating or any of that kind of stuff. I was sort of freaking out, and I was not terribly helpful to them. They were really nice about that. It was interesting, because I was kind of losing my shit, and
mm,
and they came back amazingly enough, and I recognized that it was me. And
mm,
they were saying, no, the guy who was sort of freaking me out, and he was saying, no, I have that effect on a lot of people. He was really nice about it, and we ended up doing
mm.
some very good work. But that was among the dumbest things that I've done. I'm sure I could come up. I'm sure some of the folks who've seen me could come up with lots of more examples. So there's no
That's
lack.
good. We might get a lot of comments in the
Yes,
show
indeed.
notes later.
Yeah,
Great stuff. So I think we can move to our lightning round. I've got six quick fire questions for you. You can answer them, or if you want to skip them, just give me a skip.
sure.
So you ready for that?
Yeah,
Great. Number one, is cheating ever a symptom of a healthy relationship?
a symptom of what?
Is cheating ever a symptom of a healthy relationship?
Oh, a symptom of a healthy relationship. Well, I would say no by definition. If it's
Mm,
if it's cheating, then it's not healthy. Does cheating happen in relationships where the person doing the cheating would say, "No, no, I have a good relationship"? Yes,
mm,
that absolutely does happen. It
mm.
happens in relationships where it's not because they don't like their primary relationship. That absolutely does happen.
Good to know. One trait in your opinion, one trait in couples that guarantees failure.
Well, I would say lack of faith.
Lack of
As
faith.
I
Yeah.
define faith, that would be my answer to
Mm,
that. Yeah, if they come in
mm.
and saying, we don't want to think about what happened. We just want to go back. Yeah, that's going to guarantee failure, pretty much.
Cool. Can you truly love someone and fantasize about someone else?
Of course, absolutely.
Yeah.
In fact, anybody who isn't able to do that
Mm,
is probably has a pretty blah sex life. Of
Mm,
course. Yes. Yes. I mean, if, that's the thing. If a couple are both sexual beings and they want to have a sexual relationship with each other, that's a good thing, not a bad thing. The fact that they
mm,
get turned on in the world, the fact that they can find some other human being really sexy,
mm,
that's good, not bad. Now, that doesn't mean they're going to go act on it. In fact, what I would call a healthy sexual relationship is when a couple is saying, "Wow, I'm really turned on by that person," and they go and act on it with their spouse. It's like, "Ooh, I'm really horny, and here you are, and you're really hot too. So let's go for it." Yeah, of course.
good, good.
Yeah,
Um, can kids actually ruin a great sex life, or is just an excuse?
yeah, they can't help it. I mean, when you say ruin a great sex life, I mean to have babies. I don't know if do you have kids, Ash? I don't know if
I
you've
don't have right
you
now.
okay. Well,
Uh,
you could tell by my age, I'm a grandfather, so
yeah.
I've been through that, and I love my grandchildren, but I wouldn't want to have to be the one primarily taking care of them because it'd be exhausting.
Mm,
Early on, where you're not getting any sleep and you're constantly being interrupted and you're worried about it, the kids are going to hear you and all that. Oh my God, that's one
mm,
of those obstacles that I mentioned.
yeah.
Yeah, there's going to be a period of time when you first have kids that your sex life is going to take a hit, and you got to be ready for that and not panic about it, of course. Yeah.
Great, great answer. What's one lie couple tell in therapy every single time?
One lie they tell every single time. We're always lying to ourselves. I think it's
Mm,
mostly lying to ourselves. Um, Gee, I don't know. There's so many. There's so many. But and again, you can hear. I don't judge that harshly. Everybody
mm,
lies in various ways. We don't always call it lying. It's they don't they want to unknow something that they probably know deep down, but they don't want to know it. And so those are lies that we often tell ourselves. No,
got
no, it's fine. I'm fine. You're probably not. I mean, you are sometimes. I'm not saying nobody can ever be fine. I'm just saying
it.
that's the lie that often brings people into therapy.
Yeah, yeah. And the last but not least, porn. It's a healing fantasy or silent relationship killer.
All of the above. All of the
Everything.
above. So yeah. So I don't take a particular political stance about porn. There's people
Mm,
who object to it on the basis that it doesn't matter how willing people are to do it; they're being exploited. There are other people
mm,
who say no, that's not true. There are people who are really good at it and want to do it and feel liberated by it. I know couples that make use of it as part of their sex lives and it really turns them on. I know couples where one or the other just finds it so degrading they can't even bear the thought of it. Uh, if a couple feels, and this is much more often women than men, if a woman feels that a guy looking at porn is cheating,
mm,
she's setting herself up for trouble. I'm not saying the guy should or shouldn't do it. I'm just saying
mm,
if or sometimes a woman will feel like if the guy masturbates by himself that's cheating.
mm,
They're
mm,
set up for trouble. They need to be able to
mm.
talk about that in a way that isn't about it's cheating or not cheating.
Mm.
But porn, and I
Interesting.
will certainly note, kids in the current generation, especially since the ubiquity of porn on the internet, kids growing up where that's how they learn about sex, that's having some serious problems. They're both
Mm,
both boys and girls are learning that girls ought to be certain ways and boys ought to be certain ways, and they're not good ways. I mean, they're not good
mm,
ways in terms of actually dealing with a human being. That can cause
mm.
so porn can cause serious problems.
Serious problem. Great stuff. This has been wonderful, Bruce. Thank you so much for joining me and sharing all this wisdom from your secret book. If people want to get in touch with you, people want to connect with you, what's the best way to do it?
Best way is to go to my website, which is simply brucechalmer.com. So if they spell my name right, they'll get it right.
Mm,
BruceChalmer, all one word, brucechalmer.com. Go there. It'll have information about my practice, information about my books, information about that podcast that I mentioned I do with my wife, Couples Therapy
mm,
in 7 words. That's
mm.
probably the best way to do it.
Perfect. Bruce, thank you so much for joining us today and sharing your inspiring journey and the impactful work you're doing.
Thanks for having
It's
me on.
been an absolute pleasure having you on the Relationship Labs podcast.
Thank you.